In the fall of 2013, on trading desks across lower Manhattan, a ritual took place that no one announced and everyone noticed. Traders pulled BlackBerry handsets from their desk drawers. They set them down next to keyboards no one used anymore. Some were left charging, most were left dead. By December, a device that had once been surgically attached to the hand of every investment banker on Wall Street was something you found in a drawer, next to old business cards and a stapler nobody needed. 5 years earlier, that same trading floor could not function without it. In September 2010, BlackBerry commanded 33% of the American smartphone market, more than any rival, foreign or domestic. 41 million people worldwide checked it obsessively, at red lights, in church pews, under conference tables during board meetings they were supposed to be paying attention to. The press had a name for the addiction: Crackberry. The company that built it was, for one stretch of 2008, worth more than $80 billion. But the real story of BlackBerry is not a Wall Street desk cleanout, and it is not really a Canadian company's decline. It is the story of how the American office, its banks, its law firms, its federal agencies, even its president, built its entire communication infrastructure around a foreign-made machine, trusted it more than it trusted its own government networks, and then abandoned it in less time than it takes to renew a corporate lease. Every week, we tell the stories of the machines that ran the American office, and the moment the market stopped needing them. Like this video and subscribe if that history means something to you. This one doesn't begin in Cupertino, and it doesn't end on a trading floor. It begins in a small office above a bagel shop in Waterloo, Ontario in 1984, with 2 engineering students and 15,000 borrowed dollars, and it becomes, within 25 years, the most trusted piece of hardware inside the United States government. 2. Mike Lazaridis was 23 years old in 1984, a University of Waterloo engineering student who had already dropped out once to chase a contract with General Motors. He teamed up with Douglas Fregan, a childhood friend from Windsor, Ontario, who was studying engineering across the province. Neither of them had a company, a product, or much of a plan beyond a shared conviction that the way machines talked to each other was about to change. What they had was $15,000, borrowed from Lazaridis' parents, in a small office on the second floor above a bagel shop in downtown Waterloo. They called the company Research in Motion. The name meant nothing yet. It would not mean anything for 15 years. For its first decade, RIM was not a phone company. It was not even a communications company in any sense the American office would have recognized. It was a contract engineering shop, the kind of operation that survived by solving other people's technical problems for a fee. In 1986, that survival strategy paid off in a way that would define the company's DNA for the next 2 decades. General Motors awarded RIM a $600,000 contract to develop electronic factory floor display systems. Unglamorous, invisible work, the kind that never makes a press release but keeps a payroll running. It was RIM's first taste of a lesson it would spend the rest of its life relearning. The biggest, most conservative institutions in North America were willing to pay well for reliability if a small company could prove it had any. What American offices did not have in the early 1990s was a way to get email outside the building. A memo written at 9 in the morning sat in an inbox until someone returned to a desk to open it. A lawyer on a flight from New York to Los Angeles was, for 6 hours, professionally unreachable. A trader who stepped away from a terminal on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange lost the thread of a deal the moment he walked out the door. Fax machines could send a document across the country in minutes, but they could not follow a person. Pagers could summon someone back to a phone, but they could not deliver the message itself. There was a specific, expensive gap in the American workday. The gap between when information existed and when a decision maker could actually see it, and no American company had closed it. RIM found its way into that gap through a network almost nobody outside law enforcement had heard of. Mobitex was a wireless data protocol built in Sweden, originally intended for police dispatch and utility companies that needed to send short bursts of data to vehicles in the field. RIM became the first company in North America to build commercial products on top of it, and its earliest customers were not offices at all. They were police departments and military units that needed secure, always-on data links long before anyone was thinking about corporate email. That early client base mattered more than it looked like it did at the time. It taught RIM before it had ever sold a single device to a law firm or a bank, that its core competency was not making phones. It was making a network behave like it could be trusted with something that mattered. By the middle of the 1990s, RIM had built two-way pagers on the Mobitex network, small, unglamorous devices that could send and receive short text messages without ever being connected to a desk. They were not yet aimed at the American office worker. They were aimed at anyone who needed to know something the moment it happened, wherever they happened to be standing. It was a narrow use case with a narrow customer base, and by any conventional measure of a technology company in 1996, Research in Motion was still a marginal player, a Canadian engineering shop with a clever wireless product and no obvious path to the corner offices of Manhattan or the Pentagon. But Lazaridis had already identified the market he actually wanted, and it was not police dispatch. It was the American executive, the lawyer, the banker, the government official, who was drowning in email the moment he sat down at a desk and functionally illiterate the moment he stood up from it. RIM's engineers had spent a decade learning how to move small amounts of data reliably over unreliable wireless networks. Now they turned that expertise toward a single obsessive design problem. How do you take the inbox off the desk and put it in someone's coat pocket without making them feel like they've left the office at all? The answer to that question would not arrive for 3 more years. When it did, it would not look like a phone, and it would not look like a pager. It would look like nothing anyone in an American office had held before. The device that solved RIM's design problem arrived in January 1999, and it did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived with a name that a marketing firm in California had spent weeks arguing over. RIM's engineers had shown the design team the device's keyboard, small black keys, tightly clustered, faintly textured, and someone thought the layout resembled the drupelets on the surface of a BlackBerry. The name stuck, and it stuck for a reason that had nothing to do with fruit and everything to do with what the device promised. Something small, dense, and packed tightly with exactly what you needed. Nothing more. The RIM 850 was not technically a phone. It was a two-way pager, roughly the size of a deck of playing cards, with a black and white screen no bigger than a postage stamp and a keyboard so small that an adult thumb barely fit each key. It weighed under 5 ounces. It had no camera, no color display, and no way to make a phone call. What it had was something no American office device had ever offered before. Email that simply appeared. Not email you dialed in to retrieve. Not email you had to remember to check. Email that pushed itself onto the screen the instant it landed on a server, the same way a pager buzzed the instant someone dialed a number. Except now the message wasn't a phone number. It was the full text of a memo, a contract red line, a decision that needed to be made before the market closed. For the American office worker in 1999, this was not an incremental improvement. It was the closing of the exact gap RIM had spent 15 years positioning itself to close. A partner at a law firm could leave for a deposition and still see in real time that the other side's counsel had sent a revised term sheet. A hospital administrator could step out of a budget meeting and know, before returning to the room, that a regulatory filing deadline had just moved. The device cost roughly $400 with a monthly service fee that ran another $40 to $50 on top of it. A price that made it, at first, a tool for executives whose companies paid the bill, not a mass consumer product. That was, for RIM, exactly the right customer. The American corporation did not need the cheapest device on the market. It needed the one it could trust with information it could not afford to lose. The breakthrough that turned the 850 from a niche executive gadget into an institutional standard was not a new feature. It was a partnership. In 1999, RIM struck a deal with a set of American wireless carriers and enterprise software companies to integrate its push email system directly with corporate mail servers running Microsoft Exchange and Lotus Notes. The two systems that, by the late 1990s, ran the inboxes of nearly every major American law firm, bank, and federal agency. This was the moat RIM's engineers had been building without anyone outside Waterloo realizing it. A mechanism called BlackBerry Enterprise Server, which let a company's own IT department control exactly what data left the building, how it was encrypted, and how fast it could be wiped from a lost or stolen device. No competitor offered anything close to it. A company could hand 500 of these devices to its senior staff and know, with a certainty no fax machine or answering service had ever offered, that the information on them was as secure as the servers sitting in the basement of its own headquarters. In 2002, RIM took the final step, releasing the BlackBerry 5810, the first model that folded a mobile phone directly into the same device that had already made email portable. It still had no camera. Its screen was still monochrome. Making a call required snapping in a headset because the phone function had been bolted onto a device engineers had built for typing, not talking. None of that mattered to the customer RIM was chasing. What mattered was that, for the first time, a single small black device in an American executive's jacket pocket could receive a merger update, forward it with a note, and place a call about it, without that executive ever returning to a desk. The track wheel on its side, a small metal wheel you rolled with a thumb to scroll and click to select, became, within 18 months, as familiar a piece of American business etiquette as a firm handshake. People checked it under conference tables. They checked it at red lights. They checked it compulsively in the fractions of a second between one meeting ending and the next one beginning. RIM had built a device for people who could not afford to be unreachable. It was about to discover that some of its customers could not afford to be unreachable in ways no law firm or bank ever would be, and that the same encryption that made a BlackBerry trustworthy to a Wall Street trading desk was about to make it indispensable to the United States government itself. By the time George W. Bush's administration settled into its second term, the BlackBerry had stopped being an executive convenience inside the American government and had become something closer to institutional infrastructure. The device's core selling point, encryption controlled entirely by the customer's own IT department, with no copy of the keys held by RIM, a carrier, or anyone else, was precisely the guarantee that federal security officers had spent years looking for and had never found in a consumer product. By 2005, BlackBerry devices running on BlackBerry Enterprise Server were standard issue across large portions of the executive branch, the State Department, and the Department of Defense. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Central Intelligence Agency issued them to agents and analysts who needed encrypted communication that did not require carrying a separate piece of specialized government hardware. For an agency built around the assumption that every channel might be compromised, a commercial device that could prove, cryptographically, that it had not been was worth more than any feature a consumer phone could offer. The clearest demonstration of how deep that trust ran arrived in January 2009, in the final weeks before Barack Obama's inauguration. The president-elect had used a BlackBerry constantly throughout the campaign, for staff coordination, for reading news coverage in real time, for staying in contact with aides without routing every message through a switchboard. Incoming presidents had traditionally been made to give up that kind of personal device the moment they took the oath of office, on the theory that a sitting president's communications were simply too high value a target to risk on commercial hardware. Obama pushed back. The National Security Agency and White House Communications Agency spent weeks engineering especially hard in BlackBerry, modified with additional encryption layers and locked down so it could only exchange messages with a short list of approved contacts, before ultimately allowing the president to keep using a version of the device he had relied on for years. It was an extraordinary concession, and it was possible only because BlackBerry's core architecture had already convinced the most security-conscious institution in the country that the device could be trusted with the most sensitive job in America. Wall Street's adoption told the same story from the private side of the same coin. By 2007, BlackBerry devices were standard issue at nearly every major American investment bank. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, Lehman Brothers before its collapse. Not as a perk for senior partners, but as operational necessity for anyone whose job involved information that moved markets the moment it became public. A trader who missed a message by 20 minutes could miss a price move worth millions. Compliance departments, meanwhile, valued the same encrypted architecture the federal government did, because it let a bank's own legal team control exactly how long messages were retained and exactly who could access them. A feature that mattered enormously in an industry defined by regulatory subpoenas and insider trading investigations. Law firms adopted it for the same reason hospitals and insurance companies did. Attorney-client privilege and patient records could travel outside the building only if the company issuing the device could prove to a regulator or a judge exactly how that data had been protected in transit. By 2008, this combination of federal trust and Wall Street necessity had made BlackBerry something no American office equipment brand before it had ever managed to become: a device with genuine command over the two most demanding, most risk-averse institutional buyers in the country at the same time. The Pentagon issued them by the tens of thousands. Congressional offices ran on them. Federal agencies that couldn't agree on almost anything else, the IRS, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, agreed that this was the one piece of commercial technology worth building policy around. And underneath all of it sat a strange, largely unremarked upon fact that almost no one in Washington spent much time thinking about: the servers routing the most sensitive fragments of American government and financial communication, the network operations centers that BlackBerry Enterprise Server ultimately reported to, sat not in a secure facility in Virginia, but in Waterloo, Ontario, inside the headquarters of a foreign company most Americans couldn't have located on a map. The United States government had built an entire layer of its communications trust architecture on top of a piece of Canadian infrastructure, and for the better part of a decade, almost no one questioned it, because the machine simply worked every single time in a way nothing else on the market did. By 2010, the machine that had started as a two-way pager for police dispatch had become something closer to a nervous system for the American professional class. And the numbers told a story with almost no precedent in American office equipment history. In September of that year, ComScore measured BlackBerry's share of the United States smartphone market at 33%, the single largest slice held by any manufacturer, ahead of every rival combined in several major metropolitan markets. RIM's own subscriber count crossed 41 million worldwide. The company's stock, which had traded in the single digits a decade earlier, had touched a high above $200 a share in 2008, and its market capitalization at that peak exceeded $80 billion, briefly making a company founded above a bagel shop in Waterloo more valuable than Ford Motor Company. The American press had already given the addiction its own name. Reporters and columnists throughout the mid-2000s had started calling it the crackberry, a joke about compulsive checking that stopped being funny once therapists and management consultants started using the term seriously in articles about executives who could not sit through a dinner without their hand drifting toward a belt clip. The habit had a physical signature that anyone working in an American office between 2005 and 2010 would recognize instantly, even now. It was the tilt of the head at 45 degrees, chin down, eyes on a screen the size of a matchbook, thumbs working the tight cluster of keys in short, controlled bursts. It was the particular click of the track wheel rolling under a thumbnail, audible in a quiet elevator, in a church pew, in the 2-second gap between a boardroom door closing and a meeting actually starting. It was checking the device at a red light and checking it again before the light had finished changing. The physical object itself had become a kind of American professional uniform. It rode in a leather holster clipped to a belt, or sat face up on a conference table during a meeting, placed there deliberately screen visible, a quiet signal that its owner was important enough to need to be reachable at all times. Being seen with one said something. Not having one, by 2008, said something else entirely, particularly inside law firms and investment banks, where a partner without a company-issued BlackBerry was, functionally, a partner the firm hadn't yet decided was worth the $400 device in the monthly service contract. The keyboard itself became a point of professional pride. Executives who had learned to type on a BlackBerry's tiny keys developed a specific, visible dexterity, thumbs moving independently and fast without looking down, a skill set that had no name and no formal training, but was instantly recognizable to anyone who'd watched a senior banker draft an email one-handed while walking through an airport terminal. RIM's own numbers through 2010 gave no indication that any of this was fragile. The company shipped devices by the tens of millions and would go on to post its highest ever annual shipment total the following year, moving 52 million BlackBerry units in 2011 alone, the peak year of the company's entire history, arriving a full 4 years after a rival's product had already gone on sale and quietly begun rewriting the rules RIM believed it had permanently won. Because by 2010, the device that Apple had introduced in 2007 was no longer a toy for teenagers and design enthusiasts. Whatever RIM's executives had told themselves in the beginning, it had a touchscreen keyboard RIM's engineers considered a compromise no serious professional would accept. It had no physical keys, no track wheel, no BlackBerry enterprise server integration, and, in its earliest versions, none of the enterprise security architecture that had made BlackBerry the default choice of the Pentagon and Goldman Sachs alike. On every metric RIM's leadership had spent a decade optimizing for, the iPhone looked, on paper, like an inferior product for the exact customer BlackBerry owned, which is precisely why almost no one inside Waterloo's headquarters treated it, at first, as a threat at all. The device that would end BlackBerry's dominance was unveiled on January 9, 2007, at the Macworld Conference in San Francisco, on a stage a continent away from Waterloo, in front of an audience RIM's executives did not think mattered to their business. Steve Jobs walked onto that stage and spent 90 minutes describing a phone with no physical keyboard at all, a device controlled entirely by a glass touchscreen, built by a computer company that had never before shipped a phone, aimed explicitly at consumers rather than corporate IT departments. It went on sale that June, priced at $499 unlocked through AT&T, with no BlackBerry enterprise server support, no centralized encryption management, and no relationship whatsoever with the federal government's security apparatus. By every measure RIM's engineers used to evaluate a serious business device, it was missing the one feature they considered non-negotiable. Inside RIM, the reaction was not alarm. It was something closer to professional confidence, bordering on dismissal. Co-CEO Jim Balsillie was reported at the time to have told colleagues that the iPhone represented, at most, a modest threat to the low end of the market. A consumer toy that would appeal to people who wanted to watch videos and browse the web, not to the lawyers, bankers, and government officials who needed a keyboard they could type on without looking, and who needed the security architecture that made BlackBerry the only device the compliance department would approve. Co-founder Mike Lazaridis, in interviews given in the months after the iPhone's launch, pointed to its battery life and its lack of a physical keyboard as fundamental, almost self-evident disqualifications for serious professional use. The device, in RIM's internal reading, had been built by a company that understood consumer electronics and did not understand what it took to win an enterprise contract. And enterprise contracts, RIM's leadership believed, were the entire game. For a while, the numbers appeared to prove them right. RIM's fiscal reports through 2009 showed no sign of a company under siege. Revenue for the third quarter of fiscal 2010 came in at $3.92 billion, up 11% from the previous quarter and up 41% from the same period a year earlier. The company shipped its 75 millionth BlackBerry that same quarter, adding 4.4 million net new subscriber accounts in 12 weeks alone. Read from inside Waterloo's headquarters. This was not the profile of a company losing a war. It was the profile of a company still winning one, at a scale and a growth rate most technology firms in Silicon Valley would have envied. The iPhone, whatever attention it was generating in the press, had not yet touched RIM's core institutional customer. The corporate IT department that controlled the purchasing decision for tens of thousands of devices at a time, and that still had no reason to trust a consumer product with no enterprise server and no proven security record. What RIM's growth numbers concealed was where the growth was actually coming from. The company's fastest expanding subscriber base by 2009 was not Wall Street or the federal government. Those markets were, by then, close to saturated, every desk that needed a BlackBerry already carrying one. The new growth was consumer, driven by younger users drawn to BlackBerry Messenger, the free instant messaging feature that had become, almost by accident, wildly popular among teenagers and young professionals who had no corporate IT department dictating their phone at all. RIM was, without quite realizing it, becoming two different companies at once. One still selling enterprise security to Washington and Wall Street, and one increasingly selling a messaging app to a consumer market it had never designed for and did not fully understand. Apple, meanwhile, kept releasing new iPhone models every year, each one closing a little more of the gap RIM's engineers had dismissed as permanent. Better keyboards through software, longer battery life, and, critically, an enterprise security framework that Apple began building specifically to win over the same corporate IT departments RIM still believed were untouchable. By 2010, Google had entered the same fight with Android, offering phone manufacturers an operating system they could install on hardware of their own design, at price points RIM's Canadian manufacturing costs could not easily match. RIM was no longer facing one well-funded competitor with a clever product. It was facing an entire ecosystem of hardware makers, software developers, and enterprise security vendors racing to build everything RIM had spent a decade insisting only it could offer, and racing to do it faster than a company whose leadership still believed, as late as 2010, that the keyboard war had already been won. RIM's first real acknowledgement that the ground had shifted arrived in April 2011, with the launch of the BlackBerry Playbook, a 7-inch tablet built to compete directly with Apple's iPad, rushed to market in roughly a year of development after board pressure to answer the touchscreen threat the company could no longer pretend didn't exist. The Playbook shipped without native email, without native calendar, and without native contact support, because RIM's engineers had built its operating system around a new software architecture called QNX and simply hadn't finished the basic applications by launch day. A tablet with no email built in, sold by the company whose entire reputation had been built on email, was not a product launch. It was a confession. RIM sold roughly 900,000 Playbooks in its first 9 months, against expectations of several million, and within a year the company was writing off close to $500 million in unsold inventory. It could not move even at a steep discount. The pivot that followed was more ambitious and took far longer. RIM's leadership had concluded correctly that the company's aging BlackBerry OS, the software running its phones since 2002, never rebuilt from the ground up, could not compete with the smoother, more modern interfaces Apple and Android now offered. The fix was BlackBerry 10, a complete operating system rebuild based on the same QNX architecture underneath the failed Playbook, promising touchscreen fluidity without abandoning the physical keyboard on models that still offered one. It was, on paper, exactly the right strategic bet. Modern software wrapped around the one hardware advantage RIM still believed it owned. It was also almost 2 years late. BlackBerry 10 did not ship until January 2013, 6 full years after the iPhone's debut, and roughly 5 years after Android had established itself as the second major platform. By the time it arrived, the developers RIM needed to build a competitive app ecosystem had already spent years building for 2 other platforms, and most had little incentive to build a third. The competitor that delivered the decisive, unglamorous blow was not a single dramatic product, but a quiet policy shift happening inside the exact corporate IT departments RIM had spent 2 decades treating as its unshakable fortress. Through 2011 and 2012, American companies began adopting what the industry called bring your own device policies, letting employees use personal iPhones and Android phones for work email instead of requiring a company-issued BlackBerry. Apple had spent those same years quietly building the enterprise security features RIM's leadership once insisted only BlackBerry could offer: encrypted mail profiles, remote wipe capability, and management tools that let a corporate IT department control a personal iPhone almost as tightly as it had once controlled a fleet of company BlackBerries. The compliance officer at a New York law firm or an investment bank no longer needed to choose between security and the device an employee actually wanted to carry. By 2012, that employee increasingly wanted an iPhone, and IT departments increasingly had no principled reason left to say no. The market share numbers through this period moved with a speed that had no precedent anywhere else in the American office equipment industry's long, slow declines. BlackBerry's global smartphone share stood at 19.5% in 2008. By the end of 2011, it had fallen below 9%. By 2013, it had collapsed to roughly 2.4% worldwide. A company that had commanded a fifth of the global market, losing more than 4/5 of that position in 5 years. In January 2012, with RIM's market value down 75% from its peak, co-CEOs Jim Balsillie and Mike Lazaridis both stepped down, replaced by Thorsten Heinz, an executive who had joined the company in 2007 and now inherited a turnaround that had already, by most measures, run out of time to succeed. Behind the market share collapse sat a workforce absorbing the cost directly. RIM cut 5,000 jobs in 2012 alone, roughly a third of its workforce, closing out the year with approximately 12,700 employees remaining, down from a peak that had once approached 20,000. The company that had spent a decade proving to Washington and Wall Street that it could be trusted with anything was now, quarter by quarter, proving something else entirely. That trust built over 15 years could be spent down to almost nothing in 3. The final collapse arrived on a single Friday afternoon in September 2013, and the timing was not a coincidence anyone in the industry needed explained to them. BlackBerry announced an early, unscheduled earnings warning, a quarterly loss projected between $950 million and $995 million, driven largely by a massive inventory write-down on unsold BlackBerry 10 devices nobody wanted. The company said it would cut 4,500 jobs, 40% of its remaining workforce, in a single round. The stock dropped 19% within hours of trading resuming. The company had sold 3.7 million smartphones in the preceding 3 months. Apple, that exact same day, released the iPhone 5S, and industry analysts noted, almost in passing, that Apple stood a reasonable chance of selling more phones in the following 24 hours than BlackBerry had sold in the entire prior quarter. The cascade that followed reached far beyond BlackBerry's own payroll. The specialized wireless carriers and corporate resellers that had built businesses exclusively around provisioning fleets of BlackBerry devices for law firms and banks found their core product disappearing from purchase orders within a single fiscal year. The IT certification programs that had trained a generation of American corporate technicians specifically on BlackBerry Enterprise Server Administration, a skill set that had commanded real salaries inside law firm and bank IT departments throughout the 2000s, became almost overnight a resume line from a previous era rather than a current qualification. The leather holster manufacturers who had built entire product catalogs around the belt clip case, once a fixture of every office supply and electronics retailer in the country, quietly discontinued the category. The device that had defined an entire visual grammar of American professional life, the tilted head, the track wheel click, the belt clip worn like a badge of importance, had in the space of about 3 years become something people had to explain to coworkers under 30. RIM's own name became a casualty of the same reckoning. In 2013, the company formally renamed itself BlackBerry Limited, abandoning research in motion entirely. An admission that the product had eclipsed and outlived the identity of the company that built it, and that whatever equity remained in the brand lived in 3 words on a keyboard, not in the engineering shop above the Waterloo Bagel Shop where it had all started 29 years earlier. By 2016, the company had gone further still, announcing it would stop manufacturing its own hardware altogether and license the BlackBerry name to outside partners, beginning with TCL, a Chinese consumer electronics manufacturer that would build phones carrying the BlackBerry name and keyboard, while the original company retreated into enterprise security software and the automotive systems business, built on the QNX platform it had once rushed, unfinished, into the failed playbook. The final numbers arrived with the quiet, clerical finality of a company being formally written out of an industry it had once defined. In the fourth quarter of 2016, out of more than 432 million smartphones sold worldwide, BlackBerry-branded devices accounted for 207,900 units, a market share close enough to zero that most industry trackers simply rounded it down. Barack Obama, who had once required the National Security Agency to build him a specially hardened BlackBerry just to keep using one in the Oval Office, finally gave his up in 2016, years after most of the government agencies and Wall Street banks that had once run on the device had quietly migrated everyone else to something else. The most trusted machine in the history of the American office had not been defeated by a scandal, a lawsuit, or a single catastrophic decision. It had simply stopped being the thing people reached for first, one IT policy meeting at a time, until there was no fortress left to defend. Today, the surviving BlackBerry devices exist mostly as private artifacts rather than working tools. They turn up in office supply drawers that never got cleaned out after a 2013 desk move, in estate sales alongside a decade of expired business cards, in the back of law firm storage closets next to boxes of files nobody has requested in years. A handful of enthusiasts on collector forums still hunt for mint-condition BlackBerry Bold and Curve models, the same way typewriter collectors hunt for a clean Royal Quiet Deluxe, trading serial numbers and swapping stories about which model had the best keyboard feel. On resale sites, working units in good condition sell for modest sums to a narrow but persistent market of people who still prefer physical keys to glass, a preference the rest of the industry decided, more than a decade ago, was no longer worth building a company around. The professional category that vanished with the device is harder to see but more significant. The corporate IT technician who once specialized in provisioning BlackBerry Enterprise Server accounts for a 500-person law firm, a real job with real certifications that commanded real salaries throughout the 2000s, simply stopped existing as a distinct role. Those technicians didn't retire with pensions and a gold watch. Their specific expertise, built over years of learning one company's proprietary security architecture, became obsolete the same fiscal quarter their employer's device fleet did. The compliance officers who had once built entire data retention policies around BlackBerry's server architecture had to rebuild those policies from scratch around a new set of vendors, a new set of assumptions, and no institutional memory of how any of it used to work. There is a footnote to this story that almost nobody outside the security industry knows, and it complicates the tragedy just slightly. The encryption architecture BlackBerry spent 2 decades building, the same system that once convinced the Pentagon, the FBI, and a sitting American president to trust a foreign-made device with the country's most sensitive communications, did not disappear when the phones did. It migrated into BlackBerry's enterprise software and mobile device management business, and through the QNX platform, first rushed unfinished into the failed Playbook tablet, into the operating systems now running inside hundreds of millions of automobiles, medical devices, and industrial control systems across North America. The company that could no longer sell a phone to a teenager still, quietly, secures the software running the car many Americans drive to work. In a federal courthouse storage room somewhere in Washington, D.C., there is very likely still a box of BlackBerry handsets, decommissioned and never inventoried out, sitting exactly where an IT department left them sometime around 2014. The battery is dead. The track wheel no longer turns. No one has filed the paperwork to dispose of them because no one remembers they're still there. We tell these stories because the machines America trusted with everything rarely leave with a headline. They leave in a drawer. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing how. This one ends the way it began, not in Cupertino and not on a trading floor, but in a small government storage room nobody has opened in years, with a keyboard nobody types on anymore.